The Big Picture, an official report produced for the armed forces and the American people. Now, to show you part of the big picture, here is Sergeant Stuart Queen.
Nearly 2 decades have passed since the war clouds first appeared over the Pacific, and the United States was plunged into war with Japan. Time changes all things, not the least of them, relations between men and between nations. Today, a peaceful and democratic Japan stands as a strong and close ally. But in 1941, under the firm grip of a militarist government, the Japanese were led into what was to be the most costly and tragic war in their history. The Big Picture this week presents part 1 of a 2-part chronicle of that war, as seen by the men who fought it. Different from any conflict in our history, the Pacific War was waged on an ocean battleground for military bases, which only a short time earlier had been obscure and romantic islands few soldiers ever expected to see. Many were American possessions, and the United States Navy was there to keep the peace in that part of the world.
The United States Army presents The Big Picture, an official report produced for the armed forces and the American people.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation.
But fate decreed that victory would be neither quick nor easy. The Japanese spread over the Western Pacific, making it their private preserve. Within a few months, they realized their dream of empire. Except for the dogged resistance of isolated American forces in the Philippines, enemy success was complete. On April 9, 1942, outnumbered American soldiers surrendered on Bataan. The infamous death march that followed was a milestone in the history of man's inhumanity to man. On May 6, the beleaguered garrison on Corregidor capitulated, leaving the enemy supreme between Hawaii and Australia. General Hama, who ordered the death march, accepted the American surrender from General Jonathan Wainwright. Wainwright wrote just before his capture, "We did our best. Although beaten, we are unashamed." Before the ink was dry on the surrender documents, General Douglas MacArthur promised, "I shall return." In Australia, he prepared his men for the long road back. The Australian countryside was transformed by the temporary quarters of the growing army as men and supplies were massed for the operations to come. Meanwhile, we struck wherever and however we could. Although the attack on Pearl Harbor crippled our Pacific fleet, our carriers had escaped. While the enemy still savored their early victories, a daring group of Army flyers under Colonel James Doolittle left the deck of the carrier Hornet on April 18, 1942, for a surprise raid on Tokyo. Many did not return, but their courageous actions served notice on the enemy of what was to come. May 1942, in the Coral Sea, our Navy successfully blocked the Japanese invasion of Port Moresby and helped prepare the way for a decisive American success at Midway. There, Army, Navy, and Marine flyers would be among the first to distinguish themselves in the Pacific fighting. The strategy of the Pacific called for Admiral Nimitz to press westward from Pearl Harbor, while General MacArthur's forces drove north and northwest from Australia. But first, the enemy had to be stopped in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Allied troops waged a bitter delaying action during the first phase of the Papuan campaign in eastern New Guinea. They fought for time and a chance to build up reinforcements and supplies behind their tenuous jungle lines. A cruel climate spread fever in the ranks and turned every routine task into a nightmare. But the Allies held Port Moresby. Fresh troops poured in from Australia and the United States. Men of the 32nd and 41st Infantry Divisions, debarking at the port, faced one of the most arduous and critical campaigns of the early war. To speed the counterattack against the enemy, who had advanced to within 30 miles of Port Moresby, MacArthur flew troops over the rugged Owen Stanley Mountains to the fighting near Buna. Friendly, cooperative Papuan tribesmen made a large contribution to the campaign's success. Not only were they willing workmen, they also saved many American lives while serving as guides and scouts. While the Papuan campaign continued, an amphibious thrust got underway in the Solomon Islands. The enemy had begun construction of an airfield on Guadalcanal, from which planes would soon be able to attack our communications and supply lines across the South Pacific. Our mission was to take this field and the island. Initial enemy resistance on Guadalcanal was so light that landing forces quickly established a beachhead and prepared for advance through heavy jungle. The invasion force was confident after such an easy assault, and few expected the churning hell of enemy fire that was to come. Nor did any guess that it would require 6 months to subdue the island. In New Guinea, during the fall of 1942, tropical diseases and the rigors of jungle took their toll. In tangled vines and shadowy growth, the Japanese waited, willing to sacrifice their lives rather than surrender. By January 1943, the enemy had expended 8,000 men in a futile effort to hold the area. Then Buna fell, and the threat to Port Moresby was ended. The enemy tried desperately to reinforce his troops in the face of constant air attack. Defenses in the South and Southwest Pacific was the base at Rabaul on the northeastern tip of New Britain. American strategy called for the isolation of Rabaul. New Georgia in the Solomons was the scene of the first major campaign in this operation. In eastern New Guinea, U.S. Army paratroopers dropped at Nadzab to seize an airstrip deep in enemy-held territory. From Nadzab, Australian troops moved on to Lae. The Bougainville landings in the Solomons provided needed air bases for protection against enemy air attacks and gave us another air base along the road to Rabaul. Again, we advanced through a green wall of jungle that masked a stubborn enemy. As Allied forces continued to fight and win, the myth of Japanese military superiority began to collapse. The enemy was tough, but he could be beaten. The war in the Pacific presented problems previously unknown to American fighting men. Small islands spread over a vast ocean, objectives often identifiable only on the combat map, the feeling of isolation, and the constant oppressive jungle, a formidable enemy itself. The Army Air Forces developed new supply methods to meet the requirements of isolated jungle troops. Airdrops of food and ammunition often sustained American units until the enemy was driven back or destroyed. Airstrips were torn out of the unfriendly forest in record time. Fighter planes would be based on these fields less than 225 miles from Rabaul to escort our bombers on airstrikes over enemy objectives. The drive north gained momentum until our troops were ready for the assault on New Britain, the last step in the isolation of Rabaul. Rest and recuperation camps were scarce. During their preparation for the New Britain invasion, units in New Guinea found relaxation wherever and whenever they could. Religious services were held for those who wished to attend. That went in at Cape Gloucester found no beaches. The familiar jungle grew to the water's edge, abundant with swamps and tangled ridges. The smell of rotting vegetation carried far offshore. B-25s helped soften the landing area. The troops called Cape Gloucester the southwest corner of hell. Cavalry units that stormed the Arawe sector as infantry found themselves harassed by mud and mosquitoes as well as a hidden enemy. With western New Britain in American hands, the Admiralty Islands of Los Negros and Manus became primary targets for our advance because of their airfields and harbor. The 1st Cavalry Division had the job of seizing them. Initial enemy reaction at Los Negros was light, and the remainder of the 1st Cavalry Division came ashore. After thousands of rounds of machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire had stripped the foliage and toppled the trees, troops were able to move inland with greater speed. Enemy resistance increased as the campaign progressed. Still, the Admiralties were secured by early April 1944. This victory completed the isolation of Rabaul and immobilized more than 100,000 enemy troops for the duration of the war. While the jungle fighting continued, another kind of war was being fought far to the north in the fog-shrouded Aleutians. In the spring and summer of 1943, the Japanese-held islands of Kiska and Attu were retaken after heavy bombing. "20 days of fighting in barren hills was necessary before the Army's 7th Division wrested Attu from the enemy. The Japanese secretly evacuated Kiska before Allied troops landed. Abandoned enemy supplies gave Americans a surprising change from their own combat rations. In November 1943, Admiral Nimitz forces in the Central Pacific moved into the Gilberts against the islands of Macon and Tarawa. Stepping stones to the huge enemy naval base at Truk, these small coral atolls would provide valuable lessons for future amphibious operations. The job of taking Betio on Tarawa was given to the 2nd Marine Division. In 4 days of bloody fighting, these men earned 3,000 Purple Hearts. Macon, the Japanese garrison was smaller and not as well entrenched. A regimental combat team of the Army's 27th Infantry Division established a beachhead on November 21st, 1943, and snuffed out the last enemy resistance 2 days later. Next to fall were the Marshall Islands, which had been held by the enemy since the end of World War I. In January 1944, the United States Army's 7th Division, veterans of the Aleutians, were assigned the biggest and toughest objective of all, Kwajalein. Experience gained from earlier landings, combined with improved support from air and naval forces, enabled the division to crush the enemy within 8 days. When Admiral Nimitz and his staff arrived to inspect the island, they found that lessons learned at Tarawa had paid off. Enemy losses had been severe, our own relatively light. Meanwhile, MacArthur was preparing for amphibious landings on the Japanese flanks at Hollandia and Aitapi to provide new advanced bases for the drive on the Philippines. Low-level bomb runs by B-25s once again proved their worth. Three excellent enemy airfields at Hollandia were among our objectives. To take them, MacArthur would use the 41st Division, one of the toughest jungle outfits under his command. With them would fight a new division, the 24th.
You're better physically, you're better mentally, you have better weapons, you're going to have better support, so that you're going to be able to lick him hands down when it comes to individual fighting. However, do not take him too lightly.
The men were certain not to take him lightly. Briefings covered tactical aspects of the operations, including the treatment of prisoners.
Now, when we get them, maybe that they will have gone for a long time without water, perhaps without food. All right, give them a drink of water if you like. Give them something to eat if you like. But don't give them cigarettes. Don't give them gum. Don't give them candy, if you have any. Treat them according to the rules of war, no less and no more.
American forces again fought through steaming jungle to cut off 60,000 enemy soldiers to the east. For these captured enemy soldiers, the war was over. Their dreams of conquest and empire shattered. Much-needed airfields around Hollandia were the big prizes. Americans held at Aitapi against a relentless enemy. Continued northwest along the coast to WWII Army. They cleaned out the enemy from the caves and ridges of Biak. They secured little Numfor Island, and moved on to the tip of New Guinea. Not only the enemy waged war, American troops were set upon by leeches, centipedes, fire ants, and mosquitoes. In a climate where clothing mildewed, leather rotted, and bayonets rusted in a day, they fought on and won. Hope rose steadily through the spring and summer of 1944. Not all the men would see the end, but at last that end seemed in sight. With the addition of new airfields, our planes were able to strike more often at the critical supply lines which supported far-flung enemy defenses. In rear areas, supply agencies gathered equipment and loaded vehicles and troops aboard ships to support Allied operations throughout the Pacific theater. By the summer of 1944, General MacArthur's forces were ready to move on toward the Philippines, while Admiral Nimitz prepared for the early invasion of the Marianas. The inevitable triumph over Japan was still a year in the future, but the way was clearly marked.
The United States Army presents The Big Picture, an official report produced for the armed forces and the American people. Now, to show you part of the big picture, here is Sergeant Stuart Queen.
In part one of our two-part documentary on World War II in the Pacific, we saw how American forces rallied after early setbacks forced the enemy on the defensive. Successive Allied victories in the Central and South Pacific during 1943 made possible the great sweeping drives the following year, which cost the enemy all his early gains. Now we will witness the final stages of that epic struggle.
With the capture of the Marshall Islands by the combined American forces under Admiral Nimitz and the success of General MacArthur's operations in the Southwest Pacific, the next step in the Allied plan was the invasion of the Marianas. 6 months ahead of schedule, Saipan and the Marianas became the target of 2 Marine divisions on June 15, 1944. Five days later, the Army's 27th Infantry Division went in to reinforce the beachhead. Enemy soldiers, refusing to surrender, holed up on hills and in caves. Many had to be blasted out. The surrender of enemy troops did not come easily. At times, Japanese prisoners were used to urge their comrades to surrender rather than be buried alive. Guam, which the enemy had overrun early in the war, was pounded from the air and sea. The invasion of Guam took place on July 21, 1944. The enemy resisted the bold attacks of American soldiers and Marines for 19 days before the island again became a United States possession. During the fighting in the Marianas, Army engineers and Navy Seabees had begun work on an extensive system of B-29 airfields. In November of 1944, the first B-29s from Saipan flew against Japan. Between Guam and the Philippines were the Palau Islands. In September of 1944, the 1st Marine Division pushed ashore on Peleliu. The Army's 81st Division landed on nearby Angar Island. Navy and Marine casualties amounted to nearly 12,000 men, while the Japanese garrisons were all but wiped out. On the same day that Nimitz forces invaded the Palaus, MacArthur's troops, in a strategically converging attack, jumped from the western tip of New Guinea to Morotai Island. With the landings on the Palaus and Morotai, the twin drives across the Pacific were completed, and American forces stood upon the threshold of the Philippines. To the men who had carried the fight from Hawaii and Australia to the Palaus and Morotai, the Philippines had long stood as a symbol on which their determination and hopes had focused. We had lost those islands in the grim early days of the war, and with them we had lost military advantage and a measure of our self-confidence. Now, 3 years later, a large and powerful armada converged upon those islands 2 months ahead of the Allied schedule. Destination, Leyte. Purpose, liberation. General MacArthur had promised to return, and return he did. On October 20, 1944, 4 American Army divisions stormed the Leyte beaches to begin one of the last great campaigns of the Pacific War. To intercept our invasion force and destroy the American 3rd and 7th fleets, the enemy divided the bulk of their ships into 3 sections and sent them toward Leyte. On October 25 and 26, the greatest naval battle in history took place, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The enemy lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers, breaking the back of their naval power. The fighting on Leyte reached a climax with an end run to the west coast at Ormoc. Leyte was ours by Christmas 1944. Even before Leyte was secure, troops of the 6th Army had moved on to Mindoro in preparation for the invasion of Luzon. Then, on January 9, 1945, the 6th Army landed on the main island of Luzon. A people who had existed 3 years under enemy rule welcomed their liberators with unrestrained joy. Filipino guerrillas had waged continuous war against the enemy during the occupation. Now, armed and equipped as units of the new Philippine Army, they fought side by side with advancing Americans to drive the invader from their soil. While the American drive from the initial beachhead at Lingayen Gulf gained momentum, more troops landed on the west coast of Luzon, both north of Bataan Peninsula and south of Manila. Enemy forces were concentrating their defenses in the rugged mountain terrain, and the task of routing them was exhausting and hazardous.
I don't know if they're going to be doing okay. They're flying down there at 20-degree altitude, but they're doing okay. They're doing okay. They're flying too much from northwest, too much from northwest to southeast. That is good. That is right on the ball. Bombs. Very nicely placed.
The mission of attacking this ridge directly to our rear, which is about 2380 on the map. B Company is moving through F Company's present position, located on this high ground back there. They're going to pass through F Company and attack up towards the same hill, 2380. Now, can you give me a concentration on that hill?
On 2380?
Right.
Yes, we have the 4.2 mortars, the 155, 105, and 75, all zeroed around the hill.
A daring raid on Cabanatuan prison brought freedom to hundreds of survivors of the Death March in Corregidor. The push toward Manila went well as town after town fell to American soldiers. By early February, the 1st Cavalry, the 37th Infantry, and the 11th Airborne Divisions converged upon the city. The enemy defended Manila one building at a time. bloodiest battles of the Pacific War was fought in the Rizal Baseball Stadium in Manila. There, American tanks in the infield fired their guns point blank at enemy defenders who were hidden in the grandstands. The climax came with an assault on Intramuros, the old Spanish-built walled city. Before our Navy could use Manila Bay, the enemy garrison on Corregidor had to be subdued. The 503rd Parachute Infantry dropped on the island February 16. With the help of amphibious elements from the 24th Division, the paratroopers took the heavily fortified position within 2 weeks. General MacArthur arrived to congratulate his men. After securing Manila and Manila Bay, the 6th Army had to clean up the rest of Luzon and rout the Japanese out of mountain strongholds into which they had retreated. In the mountains of northern Luzon, organized resistance continued until the end of the war. While the 6th Army was finishing the job on Luzon, the 8th Army moved into the southern Philippines and in a rapid series of amphibious operations cleared Palawan, the Zamboanga Peninsula, the Sulu Archipelago, Panay Island, Cebu, Negros, and finally eastern Mindanao. With the Luzon campaign well along, and following the seizure of Iwo Jima in February 1945, Nimitz prepared for the assault against Okinawa on April 1st, 1945. American naval vessels converged upon Okinawa and began the heaviest pre-landing bombardment of the Pacific War. In the afternoon, 50,000 troops were ashore on an 8-mile beachhead, while the enemy played possum. On April 6th, Japanese pilots of the ill-famed Kamikaze Corps flew their suicide planes against our fleet. In 36 hours, 383 attacking planes were shot down. General Simon Bolivar Buckner's troops found northern resistance comparatively light, while the 10th Army in the south found some of the strongest resistance yet encountered in the Pacific. The road to victory on Okinawa took nearly 3 months to travel and cost American forces almost 40,000 casualties, including the life of General Buckner. The Okinawa campaign had been a highly successful air, sea, and ground operation carried out under conditions favoring the enemy. We had now reached the doorstep of Japan. By the end of May 1945, with the European war over, American military power was supreme from California to the China coast. During the early summer months, the tempo of air attacks on the Japanese main islands was sharply increased. B-29s of the Army's Strategic Air Force, operating from bases in the Marianas, were averaging 1,200 sorties a week over enemy industrial targets. Fighter cover from Iwo Jima protected the big bombers against enemy interception. On August 6th, the B-29, the Enola Gay, took off from Tinian Island and headed for the industrial city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 that morning, the Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on a city. Three days later, the only other atomic weapon then in existence fell on Nagasaki, a nation that only a few years earlier had embarked upon a war to expand its empire had reaped a bitter reward. Hiroshima and Nagasaki lay in ashes. A major portion of Japanese industry had been destroyed by the firebomb raids of our B-29s. Her mighty Navy and Air Force had been decimated, and the Imperial Army was a skeleton of its former self. Both victors and vanquished cautiously approached the matters of unconditional surrender and occupation. Under the Japanese military code of Bushido, nothing short of a direct order from the emperor could have persuaded commanders to lay down their arms. But the emperor had given the order, and the armed forces complied. American troops quickly flew to airstrips that enemy fighter planes had been using only a few days before. In the last amphibious landing of the war, more troops went ashore to assist in the occupation. American military and naval personnel in Japanese prison camps were released. Liberated and liberators shared in the happiness that followed. The Allied High Command estimated that more than 1 million casualties had been avoided when the Japanese capitulation canceled invasion plans. Japanese officials later expressed their relief and gratitude for the fair and just treatment their nation received at the hands of occupation troops. Although the warlords who had brought on the conflict were subsequently brought to trial, the Japanese people were permitted and even encouraged to make the quickest possible transition to useful, peaceful activity without American interference. Engineer units immediately pitched in to help rebuild what our bombers had destroyed. After years of propaganda and heavily censored news, a free press kept the Japanese people abreast of daily developments. From the first day of the occupation, American forces exerted every effort to gain Japanese cooperation. Aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the morning of September 2, 1945, Allied military leaders assembled for the signing of the formal peace agreement with Japan.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. The terms and conditions upon which surrender of the Japanese imperial forces is here to be given and accepted are contained in the instrument of surrender now before you. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated. The Supreme Commander for
of the Allied powers will now sign on behalf of all the nations at war with Japan. Will General Wainwright and General Percival step forward and accompany me while I sign?
General MacArthur used 5 pens to sign the historic documents and presented the first to General Jonathan Wainwright. The second went to British General Percival, the defender of Singapore, 2 to the National Archives, and the 5th MacArthur kept for himself. With the signing of the peace, which marked the end of World War II, General MacArthur said simply, "These proceedings are closed."